Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone this morning?
Good.
You may wonder why I've chosen the story of Esther. It's not as notable as it appears. I have assigned sermons in some seminary that I have to preach. I mean, it's not like it's a burden or anything, but it's basically there are certain subjects and topics that we have to touch on. So what I did was I chose out of what I could choose the story of Esther. And since we celebrated Valentine's Day, I thought it was fitting because it incorporates some elements of love and romance. However, with that in mind, there's much more to the story than its superficial romance. So much more. Now, Esther, it's a story about faith and how faith can be utilized to overcome fear. Fear. Now, we all, at some time or another, have experienced fear. Fear of death, fear of loss, fear of being confined, which is one of mine, fear of the dark, fear of animals or insects. My daughter hates spiders. Then there's the fear of public censure or humiliation, to name a few. But with so many fears, how can we find safety? The answer is quite simple. One must neutralize fear with faith. So let's turn our attention back to the story of Esther, and hopefully together we can give it the justice it deserves. The story, of course, unfolds with an angry king who has recently disposed of his queen for daring to stand up to him. Not only daring to stand up to him, but daring to stand up to him and his friends. And of course, he needs to find a suitable replacement. He seeks the advice of his counselors, and after hearing their proposed solution, decides to host an empire-wide, what I call beauty pageant, for the young ladies in his empire in order to find another queen. Now, the king's pageant had a lot in common with most modern-day beauty pageants, with the exception that the participants did not volunteer to be the contestants, nor did their parents willingly allow them to enter. Unfortunately, participation was not a choice. It was mandatory, and contestants were selected by force. But fortunately, however, the pageant was free, which I guess might offer the parents of the contestants some consolation, since we all well know modern pageants can be quite expensive. Which is the mother of a former pageant runner-up, we won't say queen, I can personally attest to the cost. So with that in mind, we're going to turn to the word in Esther chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa, which we heard before. He was Mordecai. He brought up Hadassah, which is translated Esther, who was his cousin. She didn't have a father or mother. Her mother had died. And Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and edict, which was, you guys have to come to this beauty pageant, is proclaimed, and all the judges, or should I say semi-judges, or should I say pre-judges, go out there and start grabbing women, Esther just happens to be one of the contestants. She's taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who of course is in charge of the women. Now it says in the Bible, Esther pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments, which I can't imagine what they were back then, along with her portion of food, and also gave her maids. Now there's 7 maids, and I could use 1 maid, but she got 7. He also advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. But of course, Esther does not reveal her people or her kindred, for Mordecai has charged her not to tell. Now the other part of the story is that Esther's cousin, Mordecai, walks around the court every day to learn how Esther is and how she fares. And when Esther's turn comes in to see the king, of course, as we heard earlier, she asks for nothing except for what she's advised. Now, of course, Esther is admired by all who saw her, and she's taken into King Ahasuerus. And Esther is loved by the king and finds his favor and devotion, as it says in the word. The king sets the royal crown on her head and makes her queen. But Esther's story begins with an explanation of who Esther is, and that's important. She's a cousin of Mordecai, she has become like his adopted daughter. And the story makes it very plain she's a Jew. Now, historically, the Jews are not very well respected or liked in that society. So when the king decides to choose a new queen, and Esther is taken to the palace along with the other young women from her, what I would say, multicultural neighborhood, her cousin Mordecai commands her not to tell anyone her ethnic origin. This command, of course, was given to save her life, and luckily Esther heeds the command, for as it states in the word, Esther, after arriving at the palace, chooses to keep it a secret. Now, we have definitely already ascertained that Esther is of Jewish descent, but what does she look like? Well, the Bible doesn't say so exactly, but we can deduce from her interactions with Haggai that she must have been beautiful, both inside and out. Now, I'm going to take some, as I say, historic license here and assume she had a really pretty face, combined with a sweet and kind temperament. Now, of course, these attributes is what any man in that place and time would have desired, not to mention even quite a few men in our day and age. And in addition, as we read earlier, Haggai places Esther in the best place and bestows extra food, beauty treatments, and maids on her. So we can be pretty sure that Haggai, who was obviously eager to win the king's favor, felt that Esther indeed was extremely likely to win the pageant and the place in the king's heart. But even with all this favor, Esther's cousin Mordecai is still very concerned about her welfare, because he walks around and hangs out in front of the king's harem where Esther is housed, and in order to just find out about her welfare and determine if she's safe. This is because he knew that Esther's racial heritage could be exposed at any time, and more than likely it would mean death. So Mordecai keeps his watchful eye on Esther for the period of time that leads up to her presentation to the king. Now, how long did she have to wait to win the king's heart? Well, we don't exactly know. But the time did come. As we learned early in the Word, when Esther had adequate time to beautify herself, she was taken before the king. Her and all the other women were taken before the king, and they were, as I say, paraded in front of the king, beauty pageant style. And the sole judge is the king. Now, you might ask why I'm calling this a beauty pageant. There's two reasons. One, that's the first thing I thought of when I read this as a young girl. And two, when I worked with kids at our camp, everybody wanted to do Esther. And you want to know why? Everybody wanted to be Esther. Because she, of course, gets the crown on her head and she saves the day. But what I had to explain to these kids was the reason why Esther got the crown on her head and the reason why she won the pageant. Now, yes, she is beautiful, and all marvel at her beauty, it says in the Word. The king obviously felt so as well, for according to what we read, when Esther's time to come into the king happened, the king loved Esther more than any of the other women, and she found his favor, and only she won his devotion. Now, I'm sure most of you could have guessed what had happened next, even if we hadn't read the Word earlier together. The king placed the crown on her head, and clearly she was the winner. Because what is a pageant without a crown? Unfortunately, though, the story does not end here. So we need to move on from all the glitz and glamour, the contestants and the crown, and get to the heart of the story. But what is the heart of the story? It's faith. Faith and how it overcomes fear. But in order to do that, we need to return to the Bible. Now, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set him high above all the officials who were with him. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated. But he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There's just certain people scattered and separated among your people in the provinces of all your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of other people, and they don't keep your commands. It is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. So if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who take charge of this business, so that they may put it in the king's treasuries. So the king takes off the signet ring from his hand and gives it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. The king then says to Haman, the money is given to you, and the people, the Jews as well, do with them as it seems good to you. Now, I don't know Haman personally, but he must have had a big ego, a very big one, for his heart was full of pride. Since Mordecai had cast a blow to that pride, he wanted revenge. Sweet revenge on Mordecai for not showing him what he felt was his properly deserved respect. Unfortunately, Haman did not think that simply killing Mordecai was enough. He wanted to kill Mordecai and exterminate his whole entire race. He essentially turned a personal vendetta into a genocide. Now let's return to the word. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate. Esther called for one of her eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why Mordecai was so troubled. So the eunuch went out to Mordecai, who was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave the eunuch a copy of the written decree for the Jews' destruction, that he might show it and explain it fully to Esther. But he also says something else. He charges the eunuch to go tell Esther to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for the lives of her people. So the eunuch went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther replied to the eunuch and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, and this is what we discussed with the kids earlier, there is but one law: all alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out his golden scepter to someone, may they live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. And when they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. Now Mordecai's request certainly puts Esther in a bind. If she goes to the king, she may die. For as she stated to Mordecai, if any man or woman goes into the inner court without being called, there's that one law: they'll be put to death. However, if she keeps silent and obeys the law, she herself might live, but at the expense of her faith, her family, and her whole entire race. So, as we say, what's a girl to do? Well, in Esther's case, she makes a certain decision. She unquestionably decides to have faith in God and do whatever is necessary to save her people. Now, I'd like us to make this personal for a minute. Aren't we as Christians faced sometimes with her decision or something like her decision? All of us at one time in our life will face something similar to this. And our choice may not have the impact on our family, on our friends, on our entire race, but it will have an impact on our very soul. For the time is coming when our faith will be tested. And if we have faith the size of a mustard seed, as one of our verses said earlier, we will be able to say to the mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing, no problem, will be impossible for us. So the question is, will we stand on the grace of God, or will we fall in the face of pressure and adversity? Well, as we know from the story, Esther stood tall. She had it all, but she risked it and stood on her faith. Our faith in Christ can overcome our fear, but faith without works is dead. What does that mean? That means we need to translate our faith into action. And I call you now to action. I call for you to confront your fears, draw strength from your faith, and decide to do what is right, no matter what the cost. You might think that's my ending statement, but it's not. So let's hold on to that thought, and let's return to the Word and see what actions prove Esther's faith. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. And after, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And there's the famous saying, if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then goes away and does everything that Esther has ordered him. Esther decides to act, but her action is dependent on her faith. How does she strengthen her faith? She strengthens her faith by deciding to fast. Fast. Isn't that what Lent is all about? Now I know that during Lent we abstain from certain foods on certain days. However, I would like to introduce a different approach to fasting. One that calls upon us to fast or abstain from things other than food. Things that draw us away from God. What are the things that draw us away from God? What are the things that make us neglect Bible reading and prayer? The things that make us neglect family and faith? The things that separate us rather than bind us to God? Now, I'm not asking anybody to make a public declaration of these things. But what I am asking is for you to declare those things right now in your heart. The things that keep you from having a fulfilling relationship with Jesus Christ. And after you've reckoned these things, I want to call all of us to fast or abstain from these things. Now, I know it's going to be hard. I myself am not looking forward to being without some of these things. However, I and you can do all things through Christ. And as we trust Christ for the strength to let go, I ask us to also draw upon our faith. The faith to face the fear of being without these things. Draw upon our faith. And the faith to face the fear of being without these things. I would like to invite each and every one of you now to pray. Meditate on these things silently to God and ask for deliverance. Let's take a moment and do that now. And with our prayers fresh in our minds, let's return to our story. Now on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. She was opposite the king's hall. The king, of course, was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. And as soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. I'm sure she touched it gingerly. Then the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to dinner," as I said to the kids, "a banquet that I have prepared for the king." And then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request?" "Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther said simply, "This is my petition and my request. If I've won your favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another dinner, to the banquet that I will prepare for them. And then I will do as the king said." So the king and Haman went in to feast on the second day with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine, the king again says to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be given." Then Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me. This is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he that is presumed to do this?" Then Esther replied, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then, of course, Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance to the king, said, "Look, there's gallows right out there that Haman had prepared for Mordecai." I didn't use the word gallows with the kids because I didn't want to scare them. But we all know what those are. And he says, "Look, there's the gallows that have been prepared, 50 cubits high. They stand at Haman's house." And the king pauses for a moment and says, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And they called Mordecai before the king, for Esther had told the king who he was to her. Then the king took off a signet ring which he had taken from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. The king's secretaries were summoned, and a new edict was written. The edict was that all of the Jews could defend themselves. They could destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of people or province that might attack them. And in every province and in every city, whenever the king's command and edict came, there was gladness and joy, a festival and a holiday. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. And Mordecai recorded these things, and then sent letters out to all the Jews, saying, "Keep this day, the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the month, same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had turned from them sorrow into gladness, mourning into joy. For now it shall be feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food, as I told the children, and presents to the poor." So the Jews adopted this custom as Mordecai had written to them. Therefore these days are called Purim, from the word pure. This is because of all that was written in Mordecai's letter, and what they had faced in the matter, and what had happened to them. And the Jews established and accepted this custom, and it continues to this day. So this was a story about a pageant, a promotion, a persecution, a promise, and a prayer, which developed into Purim, or Day of Deliverance. Now I would like to ask all of us, including myself, to return to our earlier thoughts and remember those things that we asked God for strength to abstain from. And in faith, I would now ask us also to collectively ask God for deliverance. Brothers and sisters in Christ, I call upon you now to confront your fears, draw strength from your faith, and decide to do what is right, no matter what the cost. Let us make today our personal day of Purim by declaring our trust in God, praising God for all that has been done in our lives and all that God is going to do. Let us now ask God to pour out his blessings upon us and provide us with the strength that will overcome our fear of casting off these things that separate us from God. I would now like for you to join with me in prayer. God, we thank you for your Spirit which dwells with us today. We thank you for the strength that you have granted us. We thank you for the ability and the faith to make this our personal day of Purim. And we ask, may your Spirit flow within us and through us. In Jesus' name, amen.